review of the first two chapters? All right, excellent. So I thank you very much, Robbie, and everyone for inviting me to present and to be part of this really good challenge provided by Bishop Robert Barron. This is really getting me to rethink how I approach evangelization, and I would like to think that I've learned a lot about it already. But as I continue to learn, I never exhaust what can be given back to me if I'm retracing, even if I'm just retracing steps in a lot of ways. So I hope the same is true for you. So in the introduction to this book, we see the real description of what's going to be presented to us through a series of essays, maybe even presentations, I think, that he has given. I really love the fact that when you listen to Robert Barron and when you read Bishop Robert Barron, you hear the same tone. Like how he writes is how he speaks, which is amazing to me. I don't think that's true for me. But he's talking about the rise of the nuns. That term kind of bothers me a little bit, simply because it sounds like the nuns, and it sounds like there's like, I don't know, it's like a cognitive dissonance for me. The rise of the nuns in my vision is a really good thing. We want lots of nuns, right? But we don't want lots of nuns in as those of no faith, right? So. And that term, in case anybody's really wondering about nun, right? Why are they calling it the NONEs, the nuns? Is because, on most surveys are like, what religion do you profess? Are you Roman Catholic? Are you a Protestant? Are you a Muslim? Or do you profess none? So it's from those surveys, you have that word none, and that's how it shows up on all of the analytics that we see, whether it's a research center or report coming out. So we're dealing with people who are increasingly saying, I do not identify with any religion. And in his introduction, he talks about, or his preface, he talks about the dumbing down of the faith post-Vatican II. And we'll get a little bit more into that in these first two chapters. And, usually for a man who speaks very eloquently about things, to hear him talk about the dumbing down, right? I thought he'd have a much more special and unique word to talk about the dumbing down of the faith, but that's what he calls it. We're dumbing it down, and we got to stop doing that. And plus, we're dealing with not only the dumbing down of the faith, we're dealing with scandal, and a scandal that just doesn't leave us in the past 40 years. And it's a diabolical masterpiece, he calls it. And when he invokes that word diabolical, he's not using it just kind of off the cuff. Bishop Barron always seems to me to be very deliberate in his choice of words. It's because he knows that we are up against a malevolent being and his minions, and the devil is real. And we, as the children of light, need to be standing up in this spiritual battle against what is not true, what is not good, and what is not beautiful. In order to engage our culture and engage these people who are saying we are not of any particular religion, we need to understand the positives and negatives of liberalism. Liberalism can be a good thing, because we're talking about freedom. The issue is, what is real freedom? What does it really mean to be liberal in the truest sense? And how do we reach our ultimate sense of freedom? On the one hand, for the nuns, it's a matter of relativism. And we're, probably heard over and over again the words of Pope Benedict XVI when he began his ministry as Pope. He talked about the dictatorship of relativism. And those words are still true, and even more true as every day passes, that relativism is winning the day. And So we have to understand relativism. We have to understand the positives and negatives of liberalism in order to engage the people who adhere to no religion, or who, if you want to consider relativism a form of religion, a form of morality, or discerning morality, then it has adherents, it has disciples. And we'll talk more about that, especially in regard to the disciples of atheist evangelists, if that even makes any sense. Modern world. So in chapter 1, we see on page 4 that he talks about the field hospital. And he's referring, of course, back to Pope Francis's words about the church being seen as a field hospital. And a lot of people hear that and they focus in and have, kind of emphasized the fact that Pope Francis is a man of mercy, and he wants to emphasize the mercy of the church. And that mercy is the big part of what it means to be a Christian, which is true. But it's not just mercy. A field hospital is not just about mercy and healing. It's a recognition that severely wounded, spiritually wounded, and that field hospital comes from a real battle that is going on out there. So in order for us to, we're in the field hospital, we're bandaging wounds and trying to help people coming out of this battle. We're at the same time part of the field. In the field is going on the spiritual warfare that we are sending people out into in order to combat the errors that are out there. And we're not out there fighting the people themselves per se, right? The people are the victims. They hold erroneous ideas and what seems to them to be good. And they're pursuing those things that they think are good, but are really wounding them spiritually. And when they come to those moments when their structures and their philosophies fail them, we need to be the ones who are out there carrying them back on the stretcher back to the field hospital. And that's very hard. It's very tricky because, we're dealing with human persons, but we're dealing with diabolical forces who have influence over those human persons at the same time. And we have to do all that we can not to see in the human person the enemy that we're fighting, though they are oftentimes the voice of those negative philosophies. Many of these nuns, I need another term. I don't like saying that. Many of these non-religious people do still have some version of God. He says, but they're kind of paying lip service to some vapid sense of God. It's hollow. It's kind of like, well, when something really bad's going on and I get rescued from something, I have this sense of gratitude and I want to thank God, but I really don't know that God I'm thanking. It's just a sense that wells up within me, and it's just almost it's almost not a conscious effort on their part to have a relationship with their God, that God who is welling that sense that is welling up within them to thank something or to be grateful for something, and they dismiss it. So they have a sense of God, but it's not. There's no depth to it at all. It's juvenile. It's I'm desperate, so I'm going to throw up this prayer and see if God's really there. Sense of things. It's self-absorbed. It's impersonal, and that's not to say that people can't seek to be generous, kind, loving people in the midst of that, but that doesn't mean therefore that their faith and their religion is transformative in their lives, or has or that they have any particular religion therefore. So there's no ground for optimism in regard to where they are. But this delicious, as he calls it, this delicious dissatisfaction that they have in their lives, this vague longing and this spiritual sense is not enough. It's there and we see it and it rises up, but then it fades away like the seed among the thorns or along the path. And so we need to help people discern between this generic religion, as St. Augustine says, which is not true religion. I love what Pope, excuse me, let me get the words out right. At Pope Pius X parish is Father Pius, who says, when people come up to him and say, "Oh, I'm spiritual but not religious," he says, "Oh, I know somebody else who's spiritual and not religious. The devil. The devil is spiritual and not religious." And your eyes kind of get big and you're like, what? He says that to people? Yeah, he says that to people. And this is the sense I'm getting from Father Barron is, we've got to be those crazy Catholics a little bit. We've got to be bolder Catholics, putting challenges out there. And that's not an uncharitable thing to say. It's a challenge. It's like, okay, you want to say that? Well, let's talk about that. Let's be a little contentious about that. So, but excuse me, we can hone in on that sense of religion and make it a place to begin a dialogue. This relativism, of course, we know my truth versus your truth, and because we have different experiences, and those different experiences really are true experiences for me, and your experience are true experiences for you. It denies, though, that there's any natural philosophical underlying commonality there that we can distill down to an actual objective truth. And so, as my pastor, Father Wilkie, is bound to say, and maybe he got it from somewhere else, I don't know. He's like, we're discussing something, and I, you might say, well, I just don't feel that way. He's like, okay, well, feel your truth. Feel your truth. Is that how we discern truth? Do we discern truth strictly through our feelings? Is the challenge there? So, and this also comes from, like, no statement about God is ever completely adequate, right? So we have this challenge where we describe God through words and symbols and experiences, but we know that those are never adequate to fully describe the infinity, who God is. God is infinity. God is, but he's also inexplicable. I mean, we sufficiently explicable with the words and the symbols and the images and the experiences we have. And because of that, people are apt to say, well, that's how you feel, and this is how I feel. And there's some and because of that, people will go into these spiritual realms of sorts, or spiritual paths of, I don't know, what's that movie with, I don't even remember if it was Julia Roberts, whoever, Live, Love, Laugh, or whatever, and she goes around the world seeking something. She's seeking some kind of spiritual experience. You have these movies which romanticize the quest. Our culture romanticizes the quest for truth, but it keeps us locked in that intelligent exploration of the truth. So we're trapped in that romanticization of the quest without ever reaching a goal of the quest. And reason dictates that we come to a conclusion, but society wants to say, no, stay in that quest. The quest is where it's all at. You can't tell me that this is objectively true. Like, it's as if to say that you can't come to a conclusion and be satisfied with that. But reason dictates that the quest exists for the very reason of coming to a conclusion. So it's unreasonable to stay there. But if I do come to a conclusion, especially a moral conclusion, that dictates that I have to change how I behave. And I have to act in accord with the truth of that conclusion responsibly. But if I stay in the quest, I don't have to become responsible. And so this is what we're dealing with. This is a description of the world that we're dealing with. And he challenges that. He says, this is not an imitation of the scientific inquiry, the method of scientific inquiry. If you want to be on this quest, scientific inquiry requires that you come to that conclusion. And this method in which they value scientific inquiry over religion is really not scientific at all. And we can use that. We use that when people want to stay in the quest. We can say, what's the purpose? What's the purpose? Can we engage people in this, kind of push them on this and say, you want to say that, but what's the whole reason? And get them to start thinking about religion. He goes into a discussion on diversity and unity. And there's this uncritical valorization of diversity. We glorify diversity as an opposition to orthodoxy, because orthodoxy draws lines around things. Orthodoxy implies judgment when there is error, and that makes people uncomfortable. And this uncomfortable sense of things means that religion gets reduced to ethics. When we engage in these conversations and we bring our religious morality into it, the sense is that, well, that's just your ethic. But religion really goes beyond ethics for us, whereas for others, they're seeing it as just some kind of moral judgment. But when people want to avoid that engagement, and they want to act like, well, that's all, that's all relative. That's all based on experience, and that has a lot of gray lines around it. But compare that to their attitudes of politics, especially today, right? Do you think the election was fair? Right? Ask somebody that question. Do you think that the Democrats cheated, or do you think the Republicans are cheating? See what, now some people might generally say, well, I just don't know. And that, true, we're always going to have some people in the middle, but more often than not, somebody's going to have a pretty strong opinion politically. And he's pointing that and saying, look, you say, absolutely that this political conclusion is true. And people are pretty firm on their political conclusions these days. Says, well, just as you have those political sensibilities and those political paths that you've brought you to a what you consider to be true and necessary, you have to do that in your spiritual life. You have to do that on the quest for truth. The same applies to religion that applies to politics. So you can't leave this in a nebulous state while at the same time taking your politics and saying, well, I have very firm conclusions on that, and I clearly disagree with you and you're wrong. So whereas people are apt to be more like, oh, well, you can believe what you believe and I believe what I believe about God, they won't do the same for politics. And so that's one, this is one little strategy, another little strategy that he's giving us to enter into argument, right? And that word sounds bad, but he's saying, no, argument is good. Argument doesn't have to be uncharitable. Argument is how we challenge ourselves to either reconclude that the thing we concluded prior to this is still true, or come to a new conclusion. So we need argument in our lives. And there are more than two options, therefore, for religion. The two options that are usually posed are either bland toleration or violence. Like religion means that if you really believe this, that you have to do violence to others in order to get them to believe it. Or no, on the other end of the extreme as well, we just have to be just tolerant, extremely tolerant of everything. And that's not real. That does not allow room for real religious argument. Ethics is therefore grounded in doctrine. It's based on what we would call metaphysical and anthropological conclusions and convictions. And if they're not, if those ethics are not grounded in some sense of religion, which is metaphysical and which is anthropological, then they're going to die off. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the religion of the nuns, or the non-religion of the nuns. And so he, as he talks about for later on in chapter 3, which we won't get to today, he starts to allude to this. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas is his chapter 3 topic, and how St. Thomas Aquinas can pose opposing arguments better than his opponents. And I heard him recently in a discussion with a secular commentator, David Rubin, who's politically, libertarian, non-religious person, and they both can agree that when you're in argumentation, you need to set up the steel man, not the straw man. So the straw man argument is one in which your interlocutor sets up this caricature of an argument so that he can easily, or she can easily, knock it over or burn it down. And what we should be challenged to do in our argumentation with ourselves first is to set up the steel man, which is harder to knock down. Bring out your opponent's strongest arguments and challenge yourself with those. And that's what Thomas Aquinas did, even better than his opponents. He could describe his opponent's arguments and pose those arguments better than they could themselves. And then, having posed them better, he could then go into the actual argumentation against them that made his arguments seem even stronger, because they had to be. So for yourselves, don't go to the easy arguments of your opponents that can be knocked down. Go to the ones that you struggle with harder in order to prepare yourself for conversation. We cannot be satisfied, he says, being a debating society, because it's not just about debating and being right or being correct and being the victor of the debate. That has nothing to do with it. It's about evangelization. We believe what we believe and share what we believe because we know through the gift of faith that this is what leads people to eternal life and ultimate beatitude in heaven. Our goal is evangelization, not winning an argument. If you ever find yourself in a discussion where you're just trying to win an argument, then I'd say take a step back, step out of it. Especially if you feel yourself getting heated about it or feel yourself losing charity within those moments. Take a step back and determine if what you're doing through this argumentation, through this conversation, is actually motivated by true charity and for evangelization, for the soul of the person, rather than, quelling something within yourself in regards to being just or right. He then gets into, actually, before I go to the next step, let's just take a break for a minute and ask, is there any particular question, and you can unmute yourself and then put yourself back on mute, but is there any particular question that comes up to you at this point in this part of the reading that you've had that you thought you'd like an answer on? Okay, don't see anybody.
I have.
Oh, there you go, Robbie.
I've had several people just recently in the last few months say, well, I don't go to church, but I'm a good person. And after the second time, I thought, wait a minute. And I don't want to argue, but that's not enough. Mm-hmm. What else can I say or think about there?
So the first thing that occurs to me is, and others can chime in if you think you have some advice to offer there, I'd say is, well, tell me what makes you a good person. Tell me what is good. What does Jesus do sometimes when he's asked a question? He answers with a question. You get them to reason it out, because sometimes they're just not asking themselves the questions. So, what is your standard for good? You haven't murdered anybody. Okay. You haven't cheated on your spouse. Okay. But, have you, what does Jesus do? He's like, whoever looks at a woman lustfully. Have you been lusting after anybody? Does that meet your standard of, well, yeah, but that's not bad. That's not bad compared to murder or something. A lot of times, they need to be brought to the point of saying, well, why isn't it as bad as murder? Why isn't it mortal to your soul? Murder kills another person, but mortal sin kills your own soul. So, can you ask questions to bring them to reason through what makes them good? And then the second question might be, um, do you think God is going to judge you based on your um, evaluation of what is good or evil, or based on his evaluation of what's good or evil? And then that brings you to an kind of a primordial discussion on Genesis. So, in the beginning, the original sin was to say, I don't need God to tell me what's good and evil. The whole point of taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is Adam and Eve, as he gets into later on in these first two chapters, is to say, I don't need you to tell me. I'm going to decide what's good or evil. So I would start with, what questions come to your mind when they say that to you? And instead of trying to enter into statements, enter into questions with them.
I have a question for you, Deacon. First of all, excellent presentation as always. My question is this, is that when you're dealing with a young person who has left the church because of what they say is the behavior of people within the church, and the scandal is part of that, how do you respond to that?
So replying to a young person who has issues with the scandal and is leaving the church because of scandal?
Right.
Well, I would first ask, is this, where was this might sound weird, I guess. Where did the church never have scandal? Like, where did Jesus promise that there would not be scandal in the church? I mean, the establishment of the church, in a sense, at those very crucial moments in the life of Christ when he was being betrayed, was by an apostle, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge scandal. And, I think it rolls off pretty easily. Don't leave Peter because of Judas. But,
Right.
what institution would you remain part of otherwise? So, you're going to disassociate with human society, because
Mm-hmm.
all humans are evil at some point, to some degree. We've done a grave thing. We might have done it in secret, but how about themselves? Are you going to leave yourself? What was the worst thing you ever did? Does that mean you shouldn't associate with yourself? Are you therefore not worthy of living, and you should be cut off from even your own being? I mean that sounds a little deep and weird, but why is it just the church that faces this scrutiny? Why do you go back to politics? Which political party? They go, oh, none, because they're all crooked. Okay, well, what is it that you adhere to? And if you adhere to nothing, no group, no society whatsoever, then you're entirely alone. But that's not true, because you must engage with some of your best friends at some level. And are you, what, which one of them is going to be perfect enough for you to remain within your circle? So I hope that's effective.
Yes, thank you.
I think too, like, it's important to acknowledge, like, yes, like what has happened in the church is wrong, and like, because I think that's something sometimes, like we talk about in Christina, a lot of times you have to meet people where they are,
Mhm.
and so you never know what kind of what their experience is or how scandal has affected their life too. So I think too, like, to acknowledge how they're feeling, because I can see where people would be mistrustful of the church, especially if they were hurt by it. And then I absolutely agree with what you said about how to respond to that, but to just being mindful to meet people where they are.
Absolutely, Angie. That's is Angie who's speaking.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I actually, I appreciate that very much, and that is so true, because we're not just dealing with, right, any group within society here. Um, despite my particular question back to the person, we are dealing with an institution which claims to have the words of eternal life, right? And so that makes it even more egregious that we would have, any scandal within our numbers. But the church exists for the very point that there is scandal in the world, because it provides by the command of Christ itself the remedy for that sin, and uh, and I acknowledge that we have to also consider the fact that they're asking, they're offended, or they're leaving because they have been personally affected by it. And as members of the church, we should be the first ones to say, to ask that question, and second to say, I am so sorry. Will you, how can I help heal that wound? Or will you forgive us? Will you forgive us for being that way? Why not ask for forgiveness? John Paul II did it for the sins of the church in the past. So we can too, as members of the body. Good point. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to move on to, we're on page 13. I don't know if anybody's following along. I'm just kind of skimming from page to page here in my notes. And on page 13, we get into this religious argument, the argument of science versus religion, and that religion is non-scientific. So the new atheists are evangelizing, is the point here. The new atheists are going out and voicing their arguments to the world, and the youth are responding to it. The children of people who are in a particular faith or religion tend, therefore, to be apologetic in the wrong sense. They give, instead of being apologetic in defense of the faith, they are apologetic in the sense of being shy of their faith, or they're almost like, I'm sorry for believing in God, when they get, kind of beat over the head with this particular logic from the other side, because they don't have good arguments. They haven't been empowered to defend themselves, so they're just kind of sheepish about it. You get questions like, can God create a rock he cannot lift? And like, this is supposed to put us into some kind of, using a pun, a rock and a hard place, right? How do I answer that question? I don't know. If I say he can, then he's not all powerful. And if I say he can't, then he's still not all powerful. And, this is a non-thing, right? When people ask questions like this, we have to recognize that this is not based in any sense of reality. God cannot create a rock he cannot lift, because nothing is impossible for God, right? And if they say, well, see, if nothing is impossible for God, why can't he do this seemingly paradoxical thing? Because it's no thing. There's no such thing as a rock that God cannot lift. Nobody can put themselves into an ontological crisis that doesn't stand to reason. And this is an unreasonable statement. And as unreasonable, it is no thing. And so no thing is impossible for God. God cannot create something that is nothing. God can only create something from, that is a thing. So I don't know if I explained that well enough, but we have to be able to recognize those arguments, which are just basically nonsense arguments. They're not based in any sense of reality, or they're not even based on the sense of God that we have. That is not the God that we kind of present to people, and it's based on a misunderstanding of the kind of God that we love and have a relationship with. So scientism, then, we can call this scientism, this belief in science, really, which holds sway in our culture. It's actually self-refuting. It can never yield the conclusion that non-scientific forms of reasoning are invalid. So, science can prove things based on the realities that surround us, but there are non-scientific forms of reasoning. And so, you can't refute experience based on science. There are ideas that exist that that are intangible when it comes to this to scientific evaluation. So God is not. So we get to this point where we have to start seeing that God is not an item in our universe. God is not an item in your universe. There are therefore rational paths to God that we can follow that help us conclude to God that are not even based on faith. They're based on reason alone. And one of these is he points out in the book on page what is it, page 14, is the argument from contingency. So I'm going to turn to page 14 here just to make sure I articulate this correctly. But it's basically the sense that we are contingent beings, meaning that we are dependent on the pre-existing beings to exist, and that that if we were to follow this chain of reasoning, that in order for me to exist, my parents had to exist, and for my parents to exist, their parents had to exist, and this had to go back generations. Eventually we come to the point of saying either we have an infinite number of parents, generations, going back to infinity for me to exist. And you can take that back to, even on the evolutionary path, going all the way back to, if you want to believe in the primordial development of bacterial life that eventually became greater life forms, and then going back all the way to the formation of the solar system, and all the way back to the origin of the universe, you get to this point where you have to either say, this isn't possible. An infinite regression of causes does not exist. Therefore, there must be external to our universe a God, a uncreated creator who first started this chain reaction. So using argumentation from contingency is a rational path to conclude that God exists. Now, does it prove that God is Trinity? Does it prove that God sent his son to the earth? No, it doesn't prove those things. Those are matters of faith and revelation. But we can at least reason to God through a contingent path, or there are 5 other ways that have been proposed to reason to God apart from faith. And we should know those. We should turn to Thomas Aquinas and learn his 5 ways. And there are a couple new ways that have also been presented since Thomas Aquinas. And by having those and knowing those, we can enter into this kind of discussion and argumentation with people. Also, we need a correct definition of faith. Faith is not irrational or apart from reason. Faith is supra-rational. It is reason elevated. It is the reasoning of a religious mind about a different dimension of reality, or why there is any reality to begin with. Science cannot deal with that question. Science cannot solve the question of why anything exists to begin with. They can examine the evidence of things that exist and come to conclusions in the physical and quantum worlds, but they cannot reason by science to why anything exists at all. And faith is not credulity, right? Faith, being supra-rational, does not mean that it's just the how do I want to say this? Faith, by credulity, I mean it's a blind faith. How's that? Faith is not blind faith. That's what credulity means. It's based on evidence. Interesting, in Hebrews 11:1, this is a great verse. I love this verse. Faith is the substance. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. So if you're hoping for something, right, you don't have it yet. It hasn't been realized yet. So, but faith in the present provides substance to things yet to happen, yet to be. And it continues, faith is the conviction, or the word could be proof. Faith is the proof of things unseen. The word for substance is hypostasis. Does anybody recognize the word hypostasis? Raise your hand. Do you recognize it? Yeah, a few of you there. Hypostasis is the word that the Council of Nicaea used to describe the union between the Father and the Son. They are of the same, and the Holy Spirit. They are of the same substance. They are the hypostasis. Faith is the hypostasis of things hoped for. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the proof of things unseen. And by this, we can say we've reasoned to faith. We have used our reason and have concluded that faith is the answer. But faith is also a gift. Faith is a knowledge that is given to us by the grace of the Holy Spirit beginning in baptism. And we even receive faith kind of in a prevenient way when we are not baptized and yet seeking to be baptized. There are elements of grace that aid us to the reception of that faith in baptism. That's that knowledge of God that he infuses into us when we are baptized. So some things that have hindered us in our evangelization efforts is biblical literalism. And that's not to say that we don't have a literal sense of the scriptures, but literalism is to take the scriptures strictly and to see them strictly. And, to see them too strictly doesn't make any sense because it doesn't apply to the genre of literature you might be reading at that time in the Bible. So we have to be keen to the literal sense of the scriptures. And by that, we mean, what did the author mean to convey in the literary writing of this? Not in the literal, oh, the sun is going to, crash into the earth, or the moon is going to turn blood red, and, there's going to be a dragon that comes at the end of time. That's literalistic. But what John may have meant in the book of Revelation, based on the fact that this is apocalyptic literature and highly symbolic literature, what is the literal sense? What did he want to communicate to us? We have to be attuned to the difference between literalism and the literal sense, because literalism can be easily mocked by scientifically minded people. Modern science, though, we have to acknowledge, has emerged from a theological thought matrix. Getting a little chat box here. Okay, yeah, thank you. 5 to 10 minutes. You're killing me. All right, I'm gonna have to skip way ahead. Modern science emerged from a theological thought matrix. Nature, and this gets to the argument that nature is distinct from God. Creation can be studied because it is not divine, and it is intelligible. So intelligibility is the presupposition of any scientist. It points to the existence of a grounding and a creating intelligence. So therefore, religion and science are compatible and they're mutually implicative, he says. And this is where we see that faith and reason work together. In order for us to be free from the superstitions of the past, we had to realize that the created world is not divine. And that is what Christianity, what religion brings to us. The development of the sciences had to be freed from the sense that the world is divine, and they had to be linked to the idea that the universe is intelligible. And if the universe is intelligible and it is not divine, it can be studied and analyzed. So therefore, religion is not only compatible with science, it is the condition for the possibility of science to begin with. And to bring these first two chapters together, he does talk about, combating the dumbing down of the faith. So how do we do that? What is the most effective way of combating the dumbing down of the faith? That is, number one, to focus on truth, goodness, and beauty. And previously, it was kind of posed that you start with the truth, proceed through goodness, which leads you to the beautiful. But in the modern era of relativism, the most effective means is to go from the beautiful to the good to the true. We begin with the beautiful because a visceral experience of the beautiful can lead to conversion. Beauty is objective. Beauty is not just entertainment. Real beauty, true beauty, invades the person, chooses the good, changes the beholder, rearranges and redirects their subjectivity upward to higher forms of beauty. And we have plenty to offer in the Catholic Church in this regard. It was joked a little bit that, in particular, because we don't throw anything out. The Catholic Church hoards all of the treasures that it has received, and it is full of that beauty. And we have to present that beauty to people. And one of those beautiful tellings, one of those beautiful treasures, is the telling of the story of Israel. And we have to not focus solely on the New Testament, because the New Testament can only be understood, and Jesus, specifically Jesus in the gospel, is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and it's meaningless without Israel. And in the old, pagans worshipped the created things of the universe as God. But Israel, in its book of Genesis, places everything in its proper order. The sun, the moon, the stars, which were once revered as deities, God says, no, those are all ordered under me. Genesis is a liturgy, and it's a temple liturgy. And Adam and Eve were created to be royalty, to govern the garden. But in the fall, that was all disordered. The priestly and kingly roles were compromised. Man, therefore, tries to elevate himself and fails over and over until God breaks in. The beginning of Genesis leads us to Abraham. Noah fails. The Tower of Babel is a failure. Cain and Abel is a failure. But Abraham is God breaking in and saying, I am going to create a new priestly and kingly people. And then the story of Israel continues with this, struggle with God. They try to follow God and then they fail. And God restores them and they fail. And God restores them and they fail. And then God breaks in with the fulfillment of his promises with the cross. And he freely admits that in his dealing with this, he's very lightly touching on all of these things. But for us to tell the story of Israel is part of evangelization. And to help people to put Jesus and the gospel into its proper context. Jesus does not come according to a philosophical system. He comes according to the writings and the history and the promises of God. He is the new Adam. He is the new priest and king. He is the new temple, which is his body, and he provides us a new kingdom. On the cross, he is restoring order to what the sin of Adam and Eve brought disorder to, and bringing right praise back to God. So we have to know the story of Israel and salvation history to evangelize. He is a high priest who is greater than the temple itself, he says. He is king, he is priest, and he is sacrifice. He is all three of those things. That is what makes it greater than just the temple. To evangelize, therefore, is to proclaim Jesus as the prophetic identity of Israel, the priestly identity of Israel, and the kingly identity of authority of Israel. Now, all of that is a lot. I mean, if we were to break into each one of those aspects of our Jewish forebears and their faith and our understanding of Christ in our faith, it would be a whole lot. It would be a lot to absorb. But the reality is we can absorb it. Our children can absorb it. And the more we dumb down the faith and say that these things are just too hard for them. You know, he argues that they read science textbooks, they read, quantum physics, they do Shakespeare in high school, and we still give them, these mamsy-pamsy stories about God loving them without giving them St. Thomas Aquinas, without giving them St. Augustine to read, without giving them Pope John Paul II to read. Our children know popular culture verbatim. We can expect more of them. We definitely can expect more of them. And so he says that we should help people see God for who he is. In the Enlightenment era, God lost his place because of this idea that God and man were on the same plane, that God and man were competing for the same space. And he talks about the analogical versus the univocal. The new atheists are reacting to this idea of competition with God that became prevalent in the Protestant Reformation, that God and creation are rivals. The univocal view, that is that being or that God has one meaning and one meaning only, puts us in competition with God. Whereas the analogical, as he describes it, is we see that being or existence is derivative from God. He stands outside of our reality, but provides the entire basis for our reality. We all participate in his being, in his existence. We are not rivals on the same plane of existence with God. And so what we're combating is a counter-reaction to the philosophy that God competes with us, that God is a threatening God, that God is a human consciousness, that God is the ground of the will, that God can be pushed to the sidelines, and as deism said, that God is a menace to human flourishing, that if God exists, man is a slave, and in order for man to be free, God has to be eliminated. But he talks about the God of the burning bush, that we must be better evangelizers of God who is, that the closer we come to God, we are not in competition with God. Rather, that the closer we come to God, we radiate more. We become more of who we really, truly are. And we don't have to yield anything of our true selves when we do that. That God elevates our nature without destroying it. That he works through our ordinary daily actions without interrupting or commandeering them. And hence we can believe in an incarnation, that God can be two natures in one person, Jesus Christ, that they're not antithetical to one another. And our understanding of the incarnation can only be true in a philosophy which understands that we are not in competition with God, that the human world is not in competition with the divine. So this aggressive atheism is filling the void left by our weak arguments for the God who is. They are filling the void of poor catechetical formation and not challenging us to stand up with good reasons for why we believe. And so he says in conclusion that we need to be radical witnesses. And we have to just really go back to the basics, to the evangelical councils. Look how they love one another, he says, quoting Tertullian from the 1st century after Christ. Look how they love each other. We have to practice poverty, chastity, and obedience. And when I hear those three things, right, those are the evangelical councils, and you can read more about them in the catechism because I can't extrapolate on them here. Go back to basics, Cursillo movement, make a friend, be a friend, bring a friend to Christ. Not make an acquaintance, hope that they fill out a form, you drop them off, you pick them up, and you don't talk to them unless they wind up coming to group. Make a friend, be a friend, bring a friend to Christ. Poverty, chastity, obedience. All of us have to be practicing those things. We also have to evidence our friendship with Christ, Christ living in us. The good that we do is not of our own imagination. We don't create the good we do. We participate in the good that God is creating in and through us and in our world. Good is never our own idea. It all comes from grace, no matter if you're baptized or not baptized. It is the power of the Holy Spirit in affecting change for good in the world. And so in order to do and practice those things, that's one thing. But to evangelize the world, we also need good apologetics. That means reasons for the faith. We need to be studying our scriptures. We need a fundamental understanding of theology. And we also need the tools of the internet, YouTube, social media. I know I deleted my Facebook account, but that's for different reasons. But we have to be engaging with our world using the tools that they have given us, that God has given us. And I'll just end with one final thought here. I remember a priest at a retreat once for youth, and the youth are questioning the homosexual agenda, and they're saying, why don't we love these people? Why don't we think that this is okay? Why don't we support same-sex marriage? And the priest said to the youth who were there as a whole, this was coming from individuals, but as a whole, he kind of got up in a summary and he said, you question the church, you scrutinize the church, but you don't reciprocate by scrutinizing the world and the society that you're living in. You don't ask the hard questions of your society, you just accept them, but you scrutinize the church. What would happen if you actually scrutinized the world in which you were living in also? Then you would be fair in coming to conclusions. But until you do both, you are not being fair. So it's not just a question of questioning the church, but society as well. It's time for us to be bold. It's time for us to say weird things in front of people, things that they might not understand. Invite them to something that they might not ever consider going to, and stop making excuses that they would never accept that invitation. We have to be the crazy Catholics, but we have to be crazy in the sense of being fools according to Christ, full of love, full of charity, a radical charity that people just don't understand and want to know more about. I wish I could say 100 more things, but that's the best I can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Deacon. Make some sense out of the questions I had about the chapters anyway.